The tower crane didn't stand still. It breathed. 400 feet above the cracked pavement of downtown Seattle, the steel lattice swayed in the November crosswinds, a slow, rhythmic pendulum that would have sent a lesser man scrambling for the earth. But for Marcus Vance, the sway was a lullaby. Up here in the operator's cab, a 6x6 box of scuffed plexiglass and chilled steel, Marcus was a ghost haunting the skyline. The air smelled of stale black coffee, ozone, and the sharp, metallic tang of heavy grease. Rain lashed against the reinforced windows, frantic and diagonal, while the single wiper blade thumped a steady, hypnotic heartbeat. Thwump squeak, thwump squeak. Below him, the city was a sprawling circuit board of bleeding neon and congested arteries. The muted wails of police sirens and the endless oceanic hum of traffic were swallowed by the altitude, leaving nothing but the wind whistling through the jib. This was his sanctuary, the sky cage. Down on the ground, the world was too loud, too crowded, too full of sharp edges and demanding faces. Up here, Marcus was a god in a glass box, pulling levers that moved mountains of steel, entirely untouchable. The UHF radio clipped to the sun visor spat a burst of white noise, shattering the solitary quiet. "Vance, you awake up there in the clouds." The voice belonged to Chloe Davis, the site's lead rigger and the only person on the crew who didn't treat Marcus like a weird, antisocial hermit. Her voice was sharp, compressed by the radio's cheap speaker, but it carried a warmth that managed to pierce the damp Seattle chill. Marcus depressed the push-to-talk button on his joystick. "Wide awake, Chloe. Just admiring your hard hat from up here. Looks like a yellow skittle." A short laugh crackled back. "Focus, Skywalker. We've got one last lift before the shift ends, and the wind is picking up. 3-ton steel I-beam. Taglines are set. You ready to bring her home?" "Always," Marcus said. His demeanor shifted instantly, the relaxed observer vanishing, replaced by the precise, hyper-focused machine the construction company paid top dollar for. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the twin joysticks. He pushed the right lever forward, engaging the winch. Deep in the belly of the crane's machinery deck, the massive electric motors roared to life, a vibration that traveled through the floorboards and directly into the soles of his boots. He watched the hook block descend, a massive yellow teardrop dropping gracefully toward the illuminated pit of the construction site. Through the rain-smudged glass, Chloe was a speck in high-visibility orange, directing her crew. "Hook is down," Chloe's voice crackled. "Rigging up. Shackles are locked. Take the slack, Marcus." Marcus nudged the joystick back. The cable went taut, groaning in protest as it bit into the weight of the steel. The crane's mast shuddered, leaning slightly under the immense load. Marcus adjusted intuitively, feeling the balance of the machine in his bones. "Slack is out," Marcus reported. "Lifting. Looking good," Chloe said, her tone all business now. "Clear the scaffolding. Swing her north-northwest." Marcus maneuvered the beam with the delicate precision of a surgeon, lifting 3 tons of raw iron through the torrential rain, slewing the long jib arm across the dark sky. The load swung perfectly into place, hovering inches above the awaiting structural columns. "Down easy," Chloe commanded. "Hold, hold, perfect." She's seated, pinning it now. A minute of static passed. "Rigging is clear." "Good drop, Marcus. That's a wrap for the night. Secure the rig and come back down to earth." "Copy that." Powering down the hoist. "See you at the bottom." Marcus pulled the hook block back up, bringing it close to the jib to prevent it from swinging wildly in the storm. He released the slewing brake, allowing the crane to weather vane, freeing it to spin harmlessly with the wind rather than fight it. His shift was over. The physical labor was done. But Marcus didn't stand up. He didn't reach for his jacket. Instead, he sat back in his worn operator's chair, savoring the final moments of absolute isolation. He killed the main floodlights on the jib, plunging his small cabin into shadows, lit only by the faint green glow of his instrument panel. He picked up his thermos, unscrewed the cap, and took a slow sip of lukewarm coffee. Directly adjacent to his crane, no more than 50 yards across the dark, empty gulf of air, stood the Vanguard. It was a newly finished luxury high-rise, a sleek monolith of black glass and brushed steel that seemed to mock the half-finished concrete skeleton Marcus was currently building. The Vanguard was a vertical fortress for the ultra-wealthy, and its crown jewel was the 40th floor penthouse. Because of the crane's current height, Marcus's cab was perfectly, voyeuristically parallel to it. Usually, the penthouse was dark, but tonight, the floor-to-ceiling windows blazed with a sterile, museum-quality white light. Marcus watched the rain streak down his own window, fracturing his view of the penthouse into liquid prisms. The interior of the apartment was a masterpiece of cold, minimalist wealth. Stark white walls, a massive dark marble kitchen island, and a sweeping living room adorned with modern art that Marcus couldn't understand but knew cost more than he would make in a lifetime. There was movement inside. Marcus squinted, wiping a layer of condensation from his plexiglass window with the sleeve of his flannel shirt. A man was pacing in the living room. Even from 50 yards away, through the driving rain, Marcus recognized him. Elias Thorne. Marcus had seen Thorne's sharp, predatory features plastered on the covers of business magazines left behind in the site's break room, and on the colossal billboards advertising the very building Marcus was helping construct. Thorne was a venture capitalist, a real estate mogul, a kingmaker in the Pacific Northwest. He moved with a restless, coiled energy, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place for 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Thorne wasn't alone. Another man stepped into the frame of the window. He was younger, dressed in a damp trench coat, his posture defensive, shoulders hunched. Marcus leaned forward, the coffee thermos hovering halfway to his mouth. The silence of the altitude created a surreal disconnect. He was watching a high-definition movie with the volume entirely muted. Thorne stopped pacing. He turned to the younger man. Though Marcus couldn't hear a single syllable, the tension in the penthouse was palpable, radiating through the glass. Thorne's jaw was tight. His hands were gesturing sharply, angrily. The younger man shook his head, taking a step backward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. An argument, Marcus thought. Just a rich man bullying someone. He prepared to look away, feeling a sudden pang of guilt for eavesdropping on a pantomime. Then the world shattered. It happened with terrifying, explosive speed. Thorne lunged. He didn't just grab the younger man. He launched himself with the feral brutality of a starved animal. The younger man stumbled backward, his arms flailing, but Thorne was relentless. Thorne's hand darted to the dark marble island. He snatched something heavy, a jagged geometric glass sculpture that had been sitting near a bowl of fruit. Marcus's breath hitched. "Hey," he whispered to the empty cab, a useless, pathetic sound. Thorne swung the sculpture downward. The younger man raised his arms to block it, but the heavy glass crashed into the side of his head. The impact was entirely silent to Marcus, which somehow made it infinitely worse. There was no crack of bone, no scream of agony, just the visual horror of the man's knees buckling. The man collapsed against the floor-to-ceiling window. Thorne didn't stop. He descended on the fallen figure, his arm rising and falling in rapid, piston-like strikes. 1, 2, 3. Dark, arterial blood sprayed in a sudden, horrific arc across the pristine white walls. A thick smear of crimson painted the inside of the penthouse glass as the younger man slid down, leaving a grotesque, wet trail against the transparent barrier separating his death from the Seattle night. Marcus sat frozen, his muscles locked in a state of absolute paralysis. The thermos slipped from his numb fingers, clattering onto the metal floor of the cab, spilling brown liquid over his boots. He didn't blink. He couldn't breathe. The sky cage, his sanctuary, had suddenly become a trap. Inside the penthouse, the frantic movement ceased. Elias Thorne stood over the unmoving body. He dropped the bloody glass sculpture. It rolled lazily across the hardwood floor. Thorne stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving violently beneath his ruined, blood-spattered suit. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, smearing red across his forehead. Then, Thorne slowly turned. He walked toward the window. He stopped mere inches from the glass, right where the dead man had left a smear of blood. Thorne looked out into the darkness. Marcus shrank back into the shadows of his cab, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He can't see me, Marcus told himself, panic clawing at his throat. Asterisk, it's dark out here. The lights are off. I'm just a shadow. Asterisk. But a sudden, treacherous flash of lightning arced across the Puget Sound, bathing the Seattle skyline in a brilliant, momentary strobe of magnesium white light. For a fraction of a second, the crane cab was illuminated. Thorne's head snapped up. Across the 50 yards of empty, rain-swept air, the billionaire's cold, dead eyes locked directly onto Marcus's face. The darkness returned instantly, swallowing the sky, but the damage was done. The connection had been made. Thorne didn't look away. He stood perfectly still, staring through the storm, staring right at the man in the glass box. Thorne slowly raised his hand, pointing a single, blood-stained finger directly at the crane. The UHF radio on the visor suddenly screamed to life, making Marcus violently flinch. "Marcus!" Chloe's voice echoed in the tiny cab, loud and oblivious. "Hey, you coming down, or are you planning to sleep up there? The elevator is waiting." Marcus stared at Elias Thorne. Thorne stared back, his hands still raised, pointing like a loaded gun. The absolute silence of the sky had been broken, and Marcus knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he was no longer untouchable. Blood on glass. It was a stark, crimson smear against the immaculate, cold blue aesthetic of the penthouse across the abyss. Marcus Vance forgot how to breathe. The air inside the cramped cab of the Liebherr 550 tower crane, his sky cage, suddenly felt as thin and freezing as the stratosphere. He was suspended 600 feet above the glittering, rain-slicked grid of Manhattan, but the dizzying distance offered absolutely no sanctuary. The wind howled against the plexiglass, rocking the cab on its mast, a terrifying pendulum swing that Marcus usually rode with a veteran's ease. Tonight, however, the vertigo had nothing to do with the altitude. Through the magnified, rain-streaked lenses of his Nikon binoculars, a high-definition nightmare played out in agonizing silence. The killer, a man moving with the terrifying, liquid grace of an apex predator, was finishing the job. Elias Thorne stood over the crumpled, lifeless shape of the penthouse's owner. The victim, a silver-haired executive who had been pouring a scotch only 3 minutes prior, lay twisted on an obscenely expensive Persian rug. The twitching had finally ceased. A dark, glossy pool was rapidly expanding across the white marble floor, catching the ambient glow of the city's neon bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Elias didn't heave with adrenaline. He didn't scramble or panic. His charcoal suit remained impeccably tailored, unwrinkled by the violent struggle. Instead of fleeing, Elias withdrew a dark silk handkerchief from his breast pocket. With excruciating slowness, he clamped the fabric around the length of a slender, custom-milled blade, wiping the steel clean of the violent mess he had just made. The storm outside raged, hurling sheets of sleet against Marcus's enclosure, but inside that penthouse, everything was a portrait of clinical, chilling stillness. Marcus's hands shook violently, the heavy binoculars rattling against the glass of the cab. "Look away," his survival instinct screamed. "Call the cops. Drop the glasses. Do something." But paralysis, heavy and cold as wet cement, pinned his boots to the grated floor of his operator's chair. Elias tucked the ruined handkerchief into a small plastic bag produced from his inner pocket. He adjusted his cuffs, pulling them down to conceal his wrists. The sheer, domestic normalcy of the gesture was nauseating. Then Elias turned, not toward the penthouse's oak double doors, not toward the private elevator. He turned toward the glass, toward the storm, toward Marcus. Marcus stopped breathing entirely. He lowered the binoculars by an inch, the heavy neoprene strap biting into the back of his sweating neck. "It's dark," Marcus told himself, a desperate, silent mantra echoing in the cramped, grease-scented cab. "I'm in the dark. I'm just a shadow against the storm clouds. He can't see me." The Azure Tower penthouse was a beacon of warm, halogen light, rendering the reinforced window panes a mirror to anyone standing inside. By all laws of physics and optics, Elias shouldn't have been able to see past his own reflection into the churning night. But Elias stepped closer to the pane, the tips of his expensive leather shoes stopping just millimeters from the sheer 60-story drop. Elias tilted his head. It was a slow, deliberate movement. The upward stare. It was an act of impossible precision. Elias didn't scan the skyline. He didn't search the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of a witness. His gaze locked instantly onto the exact coordinates of the crane's cab, cutting through the void, the rain, and the dizzying gulf of empty space. Across 300 yards of open sky, their eyes met. A jagged fork of lightning tore across the underbelly of the clouds, illuminating the city in a strobe of harsh, magnesium-white brilliance. For a fraction of a second, Marcus saw the killer's face in perfect, terrifying clarity. High aristocratic cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and eyes that were dead, dark, and utterly devoid of humanity. Elias smiled. It was a small, razor-thin curvature of the lips. An acknowledgement. A promise. Marcus vaulted backward, his steel-toed boot kicking the small space heater beneath his control console. It sparked and clattered, but Marcus barely felt the burning coil graze his ankle. He was scrambling, desperate to break the line of sight, retreating into the deepest, darkest corner of his glass-bottomed cage. "Chloe!" Marcus screamed, grabbing the heavy Motorola radio clipped to his safety harness. He mashed the push-to-talk button with both thumbs. "Chloe, goddammit, pick up!" Static crackled, thick and abrasive like grinding gears. Down in the mud and concrete dust of the ground-level security trailer, Chloe Davis was likely scrolling through her phone, entirely oblivious to the slaughter that had just occurred above her head. "Chloe!" The radio spat a burst of white noise. Then, her voice, laced with the lazy fatigue of the graveyard shift. "Jesus! Marcus! Blow out my eardrums, why don't you? What's going on up there? You get lonely?" "Listen to me." Marcus gasped, his chest heaving as he crawled back on his hands and knees to peer over the lip of the window console. "Call 911. Right now. There's been a murder. Across the street. The Azure Tower. Top-floor penthouse." A pause. The sound of chewing gum snapping over the frequency. "Wait, what? A murder? Vance, are you messing with me? Because if this is a joke..." "Look up." Marcus roared, his voice cracking. "Look at the penthouse. There's blood everywhere." He pressed his face to the freezing glass, ignoring the condensation slicking against his cheek. He looked back at the penthouse. It was empty. The victim was still there, a dark stain spreading outward to ruin the pristine rug, but Elias was gone. "Chloe!" Marcus yelled. He left the room. "He's coming down." Okay, I'm calling." Chloe's voice lost its playful edge, instantly replaced by a tight, rising thread of alarm. "I'm dialing now. Just stay in the cab, Marcus. Stay in the cab." The phrase echoed mockingly in his head. Where else was he going to go? He was trapped at the end of steel mast, suspended over a concrete abyss. The only way down was the exposed ladder that ran the length of the tower crane, a 200-foot vertical descent completely exposed to the elements, just to reach the uppermost concrete decking of their unfinished skyscraper. Marcus grabbed the joysticks of the crane, his hands operating on pure muscle memory. He swung the massive jib, the heavy motors whining in loud protest against the gale force winds. He needed the floodlights attached to the crane's trolley. He swung the boom directly over the street, separating the luxury high-rise from his construction site, angling the 1,000-watt halogen beams straight down. Twin pillars of blinding, divine light pierced the rain, illuminating the slick, black asphalt of the avenue far below. "Chloe, where is he?" Marcus demanded, his eyes darting across the illuminated ground. "Do you see anyone coming out of the Azure?" "I'm looking at the lobby doors," Chloe said, her voice trembling slightly now. "Nothing. Wait. The side alley. The service exit." Marcus strained his eyes. Through the dizzying, torrential veil of rain and the harsh glare of the halogens, a figure emerged from the narrow, shadow-drenched alleyway beside the Azure Tower. Charcoal suit, unhurried stride, The rain immediately plastered his dark hair to his skull, but Elias didn't flinch. He walked directly into the middle of the empty street, stepping willingly into the unforgiving glare of Marcus's floodlights. Elias stopped dead in the center of the avenue. He didn't shield his eyes from the blinding light. Instead, he looked up again, straight up the beam of light, straight past the skeletal ribcage of the unfinished tower, right at the mechanical behemoth hovering in the sky. He raised a hand, a slow, deliberate wave. Then, Elias turned and walked directly toward the plywood hoarding that encircled the base of Marcus's construction site. "Chloe," Marcus shouted, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "He's crossing the street. He's heading for the main gate. Lock it. Lock the turnstile." "Marcus, Chloe's voice hitched. "I see him. He's just walking right up to the gate. I'm locking the door to the trailer." "Don't just lock the door. Get out of there. Run." "The gate is chained," she said, her breathing fast and heavy over the mic. "He's at the gate. He's looking at the padlock. Marcus, he has something in his hand. Oh God, it's a bolt cutter. Where the hell did he get a bolt cutter?" "Chloe, run." A sharp, metallic snap echoed even all the way up in the cab, carrying over the ambient roar of the storm. It was the distinct sound of heavy-duty steel yielding to brute, mechanical force. "He's inside," Chloe whispered, her voice dropping to a terrified hush. "Marcus, he's on the site. Get out of the trailer, Chloe. Hide in the foundation. Do not let him see you." "He's not looking at the trailer," Chloe said. A profound, chilling dread saturated her words, colder than the rain outside. "He's walking right past me. He's not looking at me at all." Marcus felt a profound coldness bloom in the center of his chest, spreading rapidly outward to freeze the blood in his extremities. "Where's he going?" "The core," she said. "He's heading for the elevator core. The construction hoist." The hoist. The temporary exterior rack and pinion elevator that ran up the side of the unfinished building, stopping at the 50th floor. From there, it was only a 10-story climb up the scaffolding to the base of the crane's mast. Elias wasn't trying to escape into the city. He wasn't trying to eliminate all witnesses at the base. He had only one target: the man who saw him, the man in the sky. "Cut the power!" Marcus screamed, spittle flying against the plexiglass. "Chloe, hit the main breaker. Do not let him use that hoist." "I'm trying. I'm at the panel, static." A sharp, violent hiss of white noise erupted from the Motorola, so loud Marcus flinched, nearly dropping the heavy radio onto the floorboards. "Chloe? Chloe!" Nothing but the rhythmic, abrasive shriek of a dead signal. Down below, the string of temporary work lights illuminating the lower levels of the skeleton-like skyscraper abruptly winked out. The entire site was plunged into total, suffocating darkness. The radio static suddenly smoothed out into a low, pulsing, artificial hum. It wasn't just atmospheric interference. It was a localized jammer. The signal was completely, artificially dead. Marcus was alone. He stared down into the gaping black maw of the construction site beneath him. The rain lashed against the glass, sounding like 1,000 tiny needles trying to break in. Somewhere down there in the dark, amidst the labyrinth of concrete pillars, exposed rebar, and howling wind, a ghost was ascending. Elias Thorne was coming up, and Marcus Vance had absolutely nowhere to go. The death of the crane was not a violent affair. It did not explode into showers of cinematic sparks, nor did it scream a metallic death rattle into the freezing night sky. Instead, it died with a pathetic wheezing sigh. One moment, Marcus Vance was bathed in the harsh, sterile glow of the operator cab's halogen overheads, the steady, rhythmic thrum of the diesel-electric generator pulsing through the reinforced steel floor grates, warming the soles of his boots. The next moment, the umbilical cord of power was severed. The monitors on the control console blinked out in unison. The low-frequency hum of the environmental heater wound down, its fan blades spinning into silence. The floodlights mounted on the exterior jib, which had been carving a brilliant swathe of white through the smog, vanished, swallowed instantly by the dark. Marcus stood frozen, his hand still hovering over the dead joystick. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, terrifying, and profound. Up here, 140 stories above the pavement, the world operated on a different axis of physics. The wind didn't just blow, it hunted. Without the ambient noise of the crane's machinery to mask it, the gale outside the reinforced glass became a living, breathing entity, throwing its weight against the cab, causing the entire 1,000-ton superstructure to groan and sway in the darkness. Marcus exhaled, his breath instantly forming a ghostly plume of white vapor in the plummeting temperature of the cab. He stepped back from the useless console, pressing his back against the rear bulkhead. Below him, the city sprawled like a blanket of crushed diamonds scattered across black velvet. Millions of lights, arteries of yellow traffic, the cool blue grid of high-rise office windows, the pulsing red beacons of aircraft warning lights, shimmered in a constellation of profound indifference. There were 8 million souls down there, eating, sleeping, arguing, and laughing, entirely oblivious to the man suspended in a lightless box in the freezing stratosphere. The city glowed, but none of its light reached him. In the sky cage, Marcus was utterly, hopelessly alone. Marcus! The voice was tiny, distorted, and drowning in a sea of electromagnetic static. But it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He lunged forward, his knee cracking painfully against the unyielding edge of the control desk, and fumbled in the pitch black until his numb fingers found the handheld VHF radio. He mashed the push-to-talk button. Chloe, I'm here. The power is gone. Everything is dead. Did you... Marcus, listen to me, Chloe Davis interrupted, her voice tight, vibrating with a frantic energy that made Marcus's stomach hollow out. He bypassed the main junction box on the ground level. I was watching the security feed from the adjacent tower. I saw the sparks. He took an axe to the primary feed. He severed the cord. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the cold plastic of the radio against his forehead. Can you reroute? The emergency backups? There has to be a failsafe. This is a Class A heavy lifter. Chloe, it doesn't just die. The backups are hardwired into the lower gantry. Marcus, I can't hack a severed cable. The sound of furious typing echoed over the radio, a chaotic staccato of keystrokes. I'm trying to ping the cab's localized battery reserves, but he must have smashed the relay switch on his way up the base. He knew exactly what he was doing. Of course he did, Marcus whispered, the reality of the situation settling over him like a suffocating shroud. Elias Thorne was not a man who left things to chance. He was a predator of architecture, a phantom who moved through the skeletal frameworks of half-finished skyscrapers and industrial behemoths, as if he had been born of the steel itself. Elias didn't just want Marcus dead. He wanted him helpless. He wanted Marcus to feel the slow, agonizing creep of inevitability. Taking the power didn't just blind Marcus. It locked the descent mechanism. The cab was immobilized. How far away are the police? Marcus asked, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. 10 minutes. Maybe 12. Chloe said, her breath hitching. I told them it was a hostage situation. I told them heavily armed. But the perimeter gates are chained, Marcus. And even when they get inside, they have to climb. The construction elevator is dead. Everything is dead. 12 minutes. It might as well have been 12 years. Marcus lowered the radio. The wind shrieked against the glass, a high-pitched wail that rattled the plexiglass panes in their rubber housings. He turned his gaze to the floor. The operator's cab was designed with a heavy, reinforced glass panel beneath the seat, allowing the operator to look straight down at the payload. Marcus knelt, pressing his palms against the freezing floor grate, and stared down into the abyss. The latticework of the crane tower dropped away beneath him, a dizzying, geometric tunnel of yellow steel that converged into a tiny square of darkness far below. The city lights provided a back glow, silhouetting the endless rungs of the maintenance ladder that ran up the spine of the tower. He strained his eyes, looking for movement. Nothing. He strained his ears. At first, there was only the wind, the deep, resonant womp-womp of the air currents battering the metal, the creak of the jib arm shifting under the strain. But then, beneath the howling gale, he felt it. It wasn't a sound, not initially. It was a vibration. A faint, rhythmic shudder traveling up 1,000 feet of high-tensile steel, translating through the floorboards, through the palms of his hands, and directly into his bones. Clink. Marcus stopped breathing. A pause of exactly 2 seconds. Clink. It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy steel carabiner, or perhaps the steel toe of a work boot striking a metal rung. It was methodical, unhurried. Clink. Elias had begun the climb. Chloe, Marcus whispered into the radio, his voice barely audible over the roaring blood in his ears. He's on the ladder. Static hissed in response. Marcus? Repeat. I lost you. He's climbing, Chloe. I can't hear him. Listen to me. Chloe's voice cracked, desperation bleeding through the digital distortion. Lock the floor hatch. Find something heavy. Do not let him into that cab. The police are en route. Just hold him off, Marcus. The radio gave a sharp, high-pitched squeal, followed by a series of popping noises, and then went dead. The green battery indicator light on the top of the handset had vanished. Chloe. Marcus tapped the side of the radio. Chloe. Nothing. Only the oppressive, suffocating silence of the darkened cab. Clink. The sound was louder now. Or perhaps Marcus's mind was just amplifying it, tuning out the wind, tuning out the city, focusing everything on that rhythmic metallic percussion. It was the ticking clock of his own execution. Elias Thorne was a machine of a man. Marcus remembered the look in his eyes back in the Foundation pit 3 weeks ago. Cold, flat, completely devoid of empathy. Elias didn't climb with the frantic energy of a man in a rush. He climbed with the steady, relentless pace of a spider ascending its web. He knew the physics of the ascent. He knew how to conserve his lactic acid, how to breathe in the thinning air, how to utilize the 3-point contact rule. Every clink was a promise. Panic, hot and acidic, flared in Marcus's chest. He couldn't just wait here. He couldn't sit in the dark and wait for the hatch to open. He scrambled to his feet, sweeping his hands across the darkness of the control desk, knocking over an empty thermos, a clipboard, a heavy industrial flashlight. He snatched the flashlight. He clicked the rubberized tail switch. Nothing. The batteries had been stripped. Elias must have gotten to the equipment lockbox before Marcus even ascended. Think. Marcus hissed to himself, slapping his numb cheeks to focus. He dropped to his hands and knees, feeling along the textured steel floor. The cab was no larger than a walk-in closet. In the corner, behind the operator's chair, his fingers brushed against the heavy canvas of his tool bag. He yanked it open, blindly rummaging through the freezing metal tools. Screwdrivers, pliers, guide strippers. None of it was enough. His hand closed around the cold, heavy handle of a 24-inch steel pipe wrench. It weighed nearly 10 pounds. It wasn't a gun, but it was bone-breakingly solid. Marcus gripped it with both hands, dragging it toward the center of the floor. The entrance to the cab was a heavy steel trapdoor set into the floorboards, secured by a simple rotating latch. Marcus stared at it. The latch was already thrown shut, but it was just a piece of metal. Elias would have pry bars. He would have breaching tools. Clink. The vibration was stronger now. It rattled the loose bolts in the chair assembly. Marcus dragged the heavy operator's chair, bolted to a sliding track, as far over the hatch as the track would allow. It covered half the door. He wedged his tool bag under the locking lever, doing whatever he could to reinforce the barrier. Then, he knelt beside the reinforced glass viewing pane. He peered down. About 200 feet below, silhouetted against the ambient golden haze of the city's light pollution, a shadow was moving. It was a broad-shouldered mass, detached from the static lines of the crane. It moved with sickening fluidity. An arm reached up. A leg stepped. Clink. The shadow paused. Marcus held his breath, his knuckles turning white around the handle of the pipe wrench. Slowly, the shadow tilted its head upward. Even from this distance, even in the near-total darkness, Marcus could feel the weight of Elias's stare. The predator knew exactly where his prey was looking. A cold sweat broke out across the back of Marcus's neck, freezing instantly in the drafty cab. Elias reached down to his belt. He unhooked something long and metallic. He raised it, striking it deliberately against the steel upright of the laddered clang. The sound rang through the tower like a church bell, tolling for the dead. It was no longer the sound of climbing. It was a declaration. Elias hooked the object back onto his belt and resumed his ascent. The methodical rhythm returned, faster now, fueled by the proximity of the kill. Clink, clink, clink. Marcus stood up, raising the heavy wrench above his shoulder, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The temperature in the cab was plummeting, the darkness was absolute, and the city below continued to shine in blissful ignorance. He stepped back from the glass, his eyes locked on the steel hatch. He braced his legs, feeling the vibrations of the devil climbing up from the underworld, getting closer with every agonizing second. The sky cage was sealed. The cord was cut. There was nowhere left to go but down, and Elias Thorne was bringing the bottom up to him. The high-altitude wind did not blow. It screamed. It tore through the latticework of the towering leap-her crane in ragged, invisible sheets, a relentless barrage of frigid air that sought to peel Marcus Vance from his precarious perch. 800 feet above the sprawling, gridlocked arteries of the city, the air was dangerously thin and tasted sharply of ozone, freezing rain, and aerosolized hydraulic grease. Marcus pressed his back against the glass of the operator's cab, his chest heaving as his lungs fought for oxygen. His right hand, wrapped tightly around the grip of a heavy crescent wrench, trembled. The vibrations were not entirely from the cold. Beneath him, the crane's central mast was a skeletal throat plunging straight down into the urban abyss. The city below was a sprawling carpet of bleeding taillights and sodium vapor orange, utterly indifferent to the lethal drama unfolding at the apex of its skyline. Through the grated steel floor of the catwalk just outside the cab, Marcus watched the shadow ascending. Elias Thorne was coming. The severed remnants of the main communication umbilical cord flapped wildly against the yellow steel struts, a dead electrical serpent whipping in the gale. Elias had cut it 300 feet below, plunging the upper echelons of the structure into a near-total blackout. But even in the gloom of the bruised, twilight sky, Marcus could see the man's rhythmic, terrifying progress. Elias did not climb like a man afraid of the void. He ascended with the methodical, unyielding patience of a predator. Asterisk clink. Step. Pull. Asterisk the metallic snap of his heavy-duty carabiners echoed up the shaft, a death knell ringing in the hollow belly of the crane. Marcus glanced up at the access hatch to the jib, the massive horizontal arm of the crane that stretched out over the city like a steel plank on a pirate ship. There was nowhere left to climb. The apex of the A-frame was a dead end. If he tried to descend the ladders to meet Elias, he would be fighting a man whose sheer physical brutality had already left two of Marcus's crew hospitalized on the ground. Elias was armed, anchored, and armored in reinforced climbing gear. Marcus was backed into a corner of glass and steel, armed with nothing but a wrench and a desperate, suffocating terror. A sudden burst of static hissed in Marcus's left ear, startling him so badly his boots slipped on the diamond plate steel. He gripped the handrail, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Marcus, hear me?" The voice was fragmented, drowned in a sea of white noise, but it was unmistakably Chloe's. The secondary emergency earpiece, a cheap, battery-operated receiver he kept tucked inside his hard hat, was barely clinging to a signal from the ground station. "Chloe," Marcus rasped, his throat raw. He pressed his frozen fingers against the earpiece. "Chloe, I'm at the top." He cut the main feed. "He's on the final mass section. I am trapped. Can't. Wind speeds exceeding 60. Structure is. You need to secure." "I can't secure anything." Marcus shouted into the howling void, though he knew she couldn't hear him. The earpiece was a receiver only. He was utterly alone. He looked down again. Elias was 70 feet away. 65. The glow of the city caught the edge of the serrated tactical knife sheathed at Elias's chest. The man's face was obscured by a dark balaclava, but his pale eyes were locked onto the grated floor of the slewing platform above him. He knew exactly where Marcus was. Mechanical defenses. The phrase flashed through Marcus's mind, a remnant from a safety manual he had read 100 lifetimes ago. When operating under duress, the machine itself is your primary barrier. Marcus looked at the immense structure surrounding him. The crane was not just a tower. It was a kinetic behemoth, a machine designed to lift hundreds of tons of concrete and steel. Right now, it was locked in its static state, fighting the gale force winds through sheer structural rigidity. The slewing brake, the massive mechanical clamp that prevented the horizontal jib from spinning freely on its axis, was engaged. In high winds, a crane out of service was supposed to be left in weather vane mode. The brake should be released so the jib could spin freely with the wind, reducing wind resistance and preventing the tower from snapping. Marcus hadn't released it before the power was cut. The immense flat side of the jib was currently acting as a giant sail, catching the full, brutal force of the crosswind. The tower was groaning under the immense torque, fighting to stay straight. If Marcus released the slewing brake now, the built-up tension would unleash violently. The entire top half of the crane, the cab, the machinery deck, the massive counterweights, and the 200-foot jib would whip around with the speed and force of a swinging scythe. And Elias was currently clinging to the exterior of the slewing ring transition piece. Marcus shoved the radio receiver deeper into his ear, ignoring Chloe's crackling, broken warnings about structural failure. He shoved open the heavy door of the operator's cab. The wind hit him like a physical blow, instantly stealing his breath and blinding him with stinging tears. He dropped to his hands and knees on the frozen catwalk, crawling around the exterior of the glass box toward the rear machinery deck. The drop to his right was absolute. 800 feet of empty, roaring air. One slip of a frozen glove, one misstep on the grease-slicked steel, and he would fall for a solid 10 seconds before hitting the pavement. 50 feet. Elias's carabiner snapped onto the next rung. The vibration shuddered through the soles of Marcus's boots. Marcus reached the machinery deck. It was a cramped, brutalist jungle of hydraulic hoses, massive electric motors, and the primary hoist drum. The smell of cold grease was overpowering. He dragged himself toward the center, where the colossal slewing ring gear connected the rotating top of the crane to the static mass below. The manual override for the slewing brake was a heavy, industrial-grade lever secured by a thick steel locking pin, tucked beneath the main drive pinion. It was an emergency failsafe, designed to be operated only when the power failed and the wind threatened to topple the rig. Marcus wedged himself between the freezing metal housing of the hoist motor and the grated floor. He could see Elias through the gaps in the grating directly beneath him now. The assassin paused, his gloved hand reaching up to grip the final transition ladder. Elias looked up, his pale eyes finding Marcus through the steel mesh. Even through the howling wind, Marcus could see the cruel, confident curvature of Elias's eyes. The predator had cornered his prey. Elias reached for the serrated blade at his chest. "Let's go for a ride," Marcus whispered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He brought the heavy crescent wrench down on the locking pin. Clang! The pin didn't budge. The thick, viscous grease had practically frozen solid in the sub-zero wind chill. Elias began to climb the final 15 feet. He was moving faster now, sensing the endgame. Marcus swung the wrench again, putting every ounce of his terror and adrenaline into the blow. Clang! The pin shifted a fraction of an inch. Beneath him, Elias pulled himself onto the underside of the slewing platform. He was no longer on the vertical ladders. He was hanging from the underside of the spinning mechanism itself, monkey barring his way toward the access hatch. If he breached the hatch, he would be on the deck with Marcus. Marcus screamed, a primal, ragged sound that was instantly swallowed by the gale, and brought the wrench down a third time with bone-jarring force. The pin cracked loose. Marcus threw the wrench aside, gripping the heavy manual release lever with both hands. His boots sought purchase on the riveted steel deck. He hauled backward with everything he had. For a split second, nothing happened. The massive steel jaws of the slewing brake were locked tight under thousands of pounds of torsional pressure from wind. Then, with a sound like a cannon firing, the mechanical clamp disengaged. Crack boom! The vertical silence of the high-altitude world was instantly shattered by the agonizing screech of metal on metal. Released from its static prison, the immense sail of the jib caught the 60-knot crosswind. The world did not just turn, it violently whipped. Hundreds of tons of steel, concrete counterweights, and heavy machinery lurched forward with terrifying, explosive momentum. Marcus was thrown brutally to the deck, his shoulder slamming into the hoist drum housing. He screamed in pain, desperately wrapping his arms around a thick bundle of hydraulic hoses as centrifugal force tried to peel him off the platform and hurl him into the night sky. The horizon became a dizzying blur of bruised clouds and city lights. The G-forces were staggering. The crane howled, a deep, vibrating groan of overstressed steel resonating through every rivet and beam. Beneath the deck, Elias Thorne was caught entirely off guard. Hanging horizontally from the grated underside of the slewing ring, Elias was suddenly subjected to the physics of a giant centrifuge. The violent rotation ripped his feet from their precarious holds on the steel mesh. Marcus, clinging to the hoses, stared down through the grating as the world spun. He saw Elias dangling over the 800-foot void, holding on by one arm. The assassin's immense upper body strength was the only thing keeping him tethered to the machine. Elias's legs kicked wildly in the open air, the city lights spinning beneath his boots in a sickening vortex. The sheer velocity of the swinging jib was creating a lateral gravity that pulled Elias outward, away from the safety of the central mast. The massive jib swung through a full 90 degrees in seconds, the wind howling through its lattice arms like a chorus of damned souls. But as the jib aligned with the wind, the sail effect vanished. The immense momentum carried it further, turning the back jib and its heavy concrete counterweights into the wind. The crane suddenly decelerated, bucking violently as the aerodynamics shifted. The whiplash was catastrophic. Marcus was slammed against the metal grating, his breath leaving his lungs in an explosive rush. The torque rippled down the 800-foot tower, causing the entire skyscraper of steel to sway sickeningly over the streets below. Through the vibrating floor grating, Marcus watched Elias fight the physics of the whiplash. As the crane snapped back against its own momentum, Elias's grip finally failed. The assassin's hand slipped from the icy yellow steel. For a fraction of a second, Elias seemed to hang suspended in the violent, swirling air, his pale eyes wide, locking with Marcus's through the steel mesh. There was no sound, no scream, just the sudden, horrific detachment of a human body surrendering to gravity. Elias vanished into the screaming dark, swallowed instantly by the dizzying geometry of the spinning tower and the absolute black of the drop. Marcus lay pinned against the hoist drum, his chest heaving, his muscles burning with lactic acid and terror. The crane continued to slowly weather vane, groaning and creaking as it settled into a natural alignment with the gale. The violent whipping motion subsided into a slow, majestic, and terrifying rotation over the glowing grid of Manhattan. In his ear, Chloe's voice broke through the static, weeping and frantic. "Marcus!" Structural alarms. What did... Marcus! Marcus pressed his trembling face against the freezing diamond plate steel. The mechanical defenses had held. He was alive. But as the massive steel island continued to drift through the sky, totally isolated from the world below, he knew the night was far from over. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind, waiting for his heart to slow its frantic hammering against the cold, unyielding iron. The wind did not blow at 400 feet. It screamed. It was a feral, living entity that tore at Elias Thorne's clothes and threatened to peel him from the slick, freezing steel of the tower crane's final access ladder. His lungs burned with a fierce, lactic fire, and his fingers, stripped of feeling and slick with a mixture of grease and his own blood, locked mechanically onto the next rusted rung. Above him, the underbelly of the operator's cabin loomed like a suspended executioner's cage. Elias. The voice was faint, entirely swallowed by the roaring gale. But Elias felt the vibration of Chloe Davis's boots on the metal grating just above his head. He gritted his teeth, tasting copper and ozone, and shoved his aching body upward. He cleared the lip of the maintenance deck, his boots finding purchase on the narrow gangway. Chloe was already there, her left arm clutching a heavy iron wrench to her chest, her right hand reaching out to haul him over the edge. She was shivering violently, her face pale and streaked with soot, but her eyes held the hardened, desperate sheen of a cornered animal. Together, they scrambled toward the small, reinforced door of the glass operator's cabin at the apex of the crane. Elias grabbed the heavy steel latch, yanked it downward with a groan of protesting metal, and shoved the door open. They threw themselves inside, collapsing onto the corrugated metal floor of the cab. Elias kicked the door shut. He threw the heavy deadbolt, the loud clack of the lock echoing with a hollow, deceptive finality. For a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the muffled, relentless howling of the storm outside. The cabin was agonizingly small, no more than 6 feet by 6 feet, a suspended glass cube designed for a single operator. It smelled of stale coffee, old tobacco, and the sharp tang of hydraulic fluid. A worn leather chair sat in the center, flanked by control consoles, joysticks, and an array of dead monitors. They were surrounded by glass on 3 sides, and beneath their feet, a reinforced viewing panel offered a nauseating plunge straight down to the construction site. 400 feet below, the city of Seattle was a sprawling, indifferent grid of crushed diamonds scattered across black velvet. The rain lashed against the windows, blurring the neon lights into smeared streaks of red and gold. It was a terrifying, vertical silence, an isolation so absolute it felt as though they had been detached from the earth entirely. "We made it," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling as she slumped against the control console. She looked down at her leg, where a dark stain was spreading rapidly through the fabric of her jeans. "The apex. We bought ourselves time," Elias corrected, his chest heaving as he dragged himself up to look out the rear window, down toward the jib and the long, treacherous spine of the crane they had just ascended. "That's all." In his mind, he counted the mechanical defenses he had rigged on their desperate ascent. The severed counterweight cables, the heavy grease slicked over the blind ascent rung, and the high-voltage jury rig he had wired to the lower maintenance platform. It was a gauntlet of lethal traps. Any normal man would have fallen, broken, or burned. But Marcus Vance was not a normal man. Elias pressed his forehead against the freezing glass, his breath fogging the pain. He stared into the swirling blackness, waiting for the inevitable. The red aviation warning light atop the cabin pulsed with a steady, rhythmic heartbeat, casting long, bloody shadows across the metal grating outside. Clink. The sound was microscopic, a tiny metallic vibration that traveled up the steel spine of the crane and resonated through the floorboards of the cabin. Elias's blood ran cold. "Clink, he's still coming," Chloe breathed, her eyes widening in sheer terror. She tightened her grip on the heavy wrench, her knuckles turning white. "Get behind the chair," Elias ordered, his voice low, stripped of all panic and replaced by a cold, deadened focus. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the heavy steel marlinspike he had salvaged from the rigging deck. It was a crude weapon, but in the claustrophobic confines of the cab, it would have to do. From the darkness of the gangway, a hand reached up and grabbed the railing. The aviation light flashed red, illuminating Marcus Vance as he pulled himself onto the platform. He looked like a nightmare sculpted from the storm itself. His dark rain slicker was torn and scorched from the electrical trap, his face smeared with grease and blood, but his eyes, those dead, shark-like eyes, were locked onto the glass cabin with sociopathic intensity. In his right hand, he held a massive, long-handled sledgehammer, the forged steel head scarred and heavy. Vance didn't pause to catch his breath. He didn't gloat. He simply walked toward the glass door, raised the sledgehammer, and swung. The impact was deafening, a concussive boom that rattled the fillings in Elias's teeth. The heavy, reinforced glass of the door did not break, but a massive, milky spiderweb of fractures erupted from the point of impact. Chloe screamed as Vance swung again. Crack! The web expanded. The structural integrity of the door was failing. The cabin, built to withstand hurricane-force winds, was never designed to survive a blunt-force siege. Hold on, Elias yelled, bracing his boots against the base of the control console. Vance brought the hammer back in a wide, punishing arc and drove it dead center into the fractured pane. The glass exploded inward. The shattered sanctuary died in a violent implosion of crystalline shrapnel and roaring wind. The storm rushed into the tiny cabin, instantly dropping the temperature to freezing, whipping papers and loose debris into a blinding cyclone. Before the glass had even settled, Vance was through the opening, a hulking silhouette of pure violence. The space was too tight for the sledgehammer. Vance dropped it, the heavy tool clattering against the metal floor, and lunged at Elias. Elias thrust the marlin spike forward, aiming for Vance's chest, but the killer batted the weapon aside with a forearm the size of a steel beam. Vance grabbed Elias by the throat, his thick fingers crushing into the windpipe, and slammed him backward. Elias hit the front window with bone-jarring force. The glass groaned beneath his weight. 400 feet of empty air yawned directly behind him. He gagged, his vision swimming with black spots, as he frantically drove his knee up into Vance's abdomen. Vance barely flinched. The killer's free hand came up, wrapping around Elias's jaw, preparing to snap his neck. Let him go, Chloe shrieked over the howling wind. She lunged from behind the operator's chair, swinging the iron wrench with all the strength left in her uninjured leg. The heavy iron connected with the side of Vance's skull with a sickening thwack. Vance staggered, his grip on Elias's throat loosening just enough for Elias to draw a ragged, burning breath. But the blow didn't drop the killer. Vance turned slowly, a stream of dark blood pouring from his temple, his eyes locking onto Chloe. With a terrifyingly calm motion, he backhanded her. The blow lifted her off her feet, sending her crashing into the side control panel. The joystick snapped under her weight, and the cabin violently lurched to the right. The entire crane shuddered. The massive slewing ring beneath them groaned, the gears grinding in protest as the jib swung wildly in the wind. The sudden movement threw both Elias and Vance to the floor. They crashed onto the thick glass viewing panel at the base of the cab. Elias scrambled, his fingers clawing for the dropped marlin spike, but Vance was faster. He crawled over Elias like a predator, pinning Elias's chest beneath his massive knees. Vance's hands closed around Elias's throat once more, thumbs pressing brutally into his carotid arteries. Elias thrashed, his boots kicking wildly against the control panels, knocking over switches and dials. He struck Vance in the face, once, twice, his knuckles splitting against the man's jaw, but the killer's grip was iron. The edges of Elias's vision began to tunnel, closing in with a dark, suffocating velvet. Then, a sound cut through the roaring wind and the thudding pulse in Elias's ears. Crack! It wasn't a bone. It was the floor. Beneath them, the reinforced glass panel, designed to hold the weight of one seated operator, not two grown men engaged in a violent, thrashing struggle, was giving way. A jagged, white fissure tore through the center of the pane, directly beneath Elias's back. Vance heard it too. For the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossed the killer's cold eyes. He looked down through the glass, past Elias's struggling form, to the dizzying, spinning abyss of the city lights hundreds of feet below. Elias saw the momentary distraction and seized it. He reached up, his fingers digging frantically into the bleeding wound on the side of Vance's head. Vance roared in sudden, blinding agony, his grip releasing. Elias bucked his hips, throwing Vance to the side. The killer slammed into the side wall of the cabin, his massive weight coming down hard on the corner of the glass floor. A sharp, agonizing snap echoed through the tiny space. The fissure in the floor webbed outward in a chaotic explosion of white lines. The glass bowed violently downward, the structural seal breaking. A shrieking draft of freezing air blasted up through the cracks, tearing at their clothes. "Elias!" Chloe screamed, clinging to the base of the operator's chair as the cab tilted sickeningly on its mounting bolts. Elias rolled toward the center of the room, grabbing the heavy metal base of the chair just as the corner of the glass floor beneath Vance shattered completely. A massive chunk of the pane fell away, disappearing into the dark void. Vance slid toward the jagged hole, his boots scrabbling frantically against the remaining slick glass. The killer lunged forward, his massive hand shooting out and locking in a death grip around Elias's ankle. The sheer weight of the man yanked Elias backward. His fingers slipped against the metal base of the chair. He was being dragged toward the howling hole in the floor, the abyss roaring up to swallow them both, as the remaining glass around them continued to sing its terrifying, splintering song. I can help you visualize this story with a summary of the scenes. In the opening segment of the chapter, Marcus and Chloe face a life-threatening situation as their maintenance cabin begins to disintegrate high above the city grid, leaving them suspended over a dark abyss. As the floor completely fails, Marcus initiates a desperate escape using an industrial safety tether. While he and Chloe manage to swing clear of the falling wreckage, Elias Thorne is unable to reach them and is lost to the vertical silence of the abyss below. The survivors land safely on the scaffolding of a nearby skyscraper. As the first light of dawn begins to wash over the metropolis, the sound of approaching emergency sirens signals the end of their terrifying ordeal and a return to reality. Would you like a summary of the next chapter?